Great. Let's go ahead and get started on our next session. My name is Chris Raymond. I'm a senior biotech analyst here at Piper Sandler. It's my pleasure to introduce BioCryst. Today, we are lucky enough to have with us a very large selection of the management team of BioCryst, with John Stonehouse, the CEO, and the other senior leadership members from the team. Just for logistic purposes, what we're going to do here is ask John to sort of, first of all, introduce his team, and then provide for investors who might not necessarily be familiar with BioCryst story, give us a 2 to 3 minute overview of the setup, premise, the value proposition for the stock. And then what we'll do is go ahead and jump into Q&A. So this is our unfortunately second consecutive virtual healthcare conference. We are very much hoping to get back into in-person meetings in 2022. So anyway, with that preamble, I will stop talking and cede the floor to John, who will provide a setup on the company.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and great to be with you. I too wish it was face-to-face and not another Zoom presentation, but anyway, I appreciate you inviting us to your conference. So let me do some quick introductions. So with me today, as you said, is our senior leadership team. So Charlie Geyer, our Chief Commercial Officer, John Booth, our Chief Communications Officer, Bill Sheridan, our Chief Medical Officer, Anthony Doyle, our CFO, and Helen Thackeray, our Chief R&D Officer. We're all going to be making some forward-looking statements. Those statements have risks, and you can find our risk factors on our website. So for investors that aren't as familiar with BioCryst, we're a company that are bringing to market from all the way back to discovery, through development, through registration, and into the marketplace, oral drugs for patients suffering from rare diseases. And this is a big deal. This is not some minor convenience improvement for patients like you see in a lot of other therapeutic areas. People that are suffering from rare diseases have a really heavy burden of treatment, if there are treatments available with injectable therapies. And the idea of taking one capsule or a tablet twice a day is a life changer for patients suffering from rare disease, because what it does, it's like taking their daily vitamin, and they start to forget that they're sick. And the idea for a rare disease patient to forget that they have an illness is a complete game changer. And we've heard that directly from patients that we've brought Orladeyo to in the marketplace. So great news is we're in the midst of our first launch of an oral drug for a disease called hereditary angioedema. Charlie's team is off to a spectacular start. And the good news is, I'll use a sports analogy. It's, we're second batter in the first inning of this game. So there's a lot more to do and a lot more runs to score. And we believe that this drug, Orladeyo, has the potential to be the market leader, the global market leader in terms of patients prescribed in the prophylactic space. So really exciting time. And beyond getting this to patients around the world, it's creating revenue that allows us to invest back into the company to create even greater value. And right behind Orladeyo is another oral drug that we have for many rare diseases, and that's our oral factor D inhibitor, BCRX9930, for complement-mediated diseases. And the beauty there is, there could be upwards of 10 to a dozen different rare disease indications that we could go after to be able to bring an oral drug to rare disease patients that suffer from complement-mediated diseases. So it's in pivotal studies in PNH and a proof of concept study in 3 different nephritis indications. And so really exciting. So the strategy here is pretty simple. We just keep repeating what we did with Orladeyo and HAE, right? We bring an oral drug into an injectable market. We understand how to get patients to switch, and we create, significant value by bringing, multiple drugs in for many, many different rare diseases. And so that's the story of BioCryst in a 2-minute spiel.
Excellent. Well, great. Well, appreciate that. So we have some time here to dig into the pipeline and also Orladeyo, but I thought maybe we'd start with that's the part of the story. And, I was actually just marveling as we were at this meeting, went back and looked at, consensus for ORLADEYO back the end of last year was $30 million, all of 2020. Obviously noting that the third quarter numbers exceeded that and then some. I think he did 37 million. And now, the consensus now is for the year is 119 million. So obviously an impressive, showing, especially given where expectations were a little less than a year ago. So maybe just a couple questions on that with that sort of setup. So on the Q2 call, you provided a 2021, guidance revenue floor, I guess, if you will, of 100 million. And you were essentially providing guidance for the last 4 to 5 months of the year. How should we be thinking about, and I know you haven't guided 2022 yet, you talked about that. Just sort of help us understand what key drivers you have line of sight on, in terms of gross to net, new prescriber growth, new patient growth, all that stuff. Again, knowing that you haven't provided guidance yet, where are some of these key metrics that you cited?
Yeah, Charlie, you want to take that one in terms of what are you seeing as the drivers for growth, and then we can come back and talk about what guidance we have given.
Sure. Yeah, Chris. As far as the launch goes, as John said, we're just getting started. We're off to a really fantastic start, and we're at the stage of the launch where new patients, we're filling the funnel. Basically, that's what's driving the growth at this point. So one thing that we're really excited about through the first 3 quarters was that we had essentially the exact same number of patients who were brand new to ORLADEYO start in Q3 as Q2 as in Q1. And then what we see going forward is we're just scratching the surface in terms of the opportunity. So as you've heard us say before, we've got about 500 doctors who treat about 50% of the HAE patients in the market. That's our tier 1. About half of them at this point have prescribed, but the intent to prescribe amongst the current prescribers as well as the current non-prescribers is really high as we do our market research. And so we think we have a lot of upside opportunity there in 2022. And then the other thing is just patient activation. It's something that hasn't happened fully yet, in terms of patients predominantly coming in and asking their doctor for ORLADEYO. So that becomes another big opportunity. And then finally, just from a payer perspective, we made great progress, particularly through the first half of this year. We expect to make some additional progress, but what we're hearing back from physicians in particular is the access process has gone a lot better than they expected. And so I think as more physicians hear that, as they hear about the great experience patients are having with the drug, as they hear about our long-term efficacy data, all of this is going to contribute to continued growth. We see ourselves as on kind of a linear growth stage at this point.
Hey, Charlie, just one more thing that might be worth talking through is, Chris, we did a lot of market research in advance of the launch that really helped us see maybe, to your earlier point, the consensus was 30 million for the year, and we did 37 in the third quarter. We saw that, and we saw it because we did market research that told us this is a switching market, and even with patients that were really satisfied and controlled on injectable therapy, that they would switch to our drug. And so, Charlie, we run some more recent market research. It'd be good for you to share what you're hearing out of that, because our market research, I think, is really reflective of how physicians feel about our drug in the market.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And part of what we do is we always use really big samples of physicians. So and as John said, we do this regularly. So in August, we surveyed another 60 HAE treating physicians. The average physician is in line with those tier 1 docs, so about 7 or 8 patients per doctor under care. And what they said was, great experience with ORLADEYO, first of all. And then we asked them in 12 months, what drugs do you expect to prescribe for your patients? And what they told us is 12 months from now, they see ORLADEYO being their most prescribed drug. Sometimes physicians are over optimistic about this, but it shows the direction we're going. And then the other thing that they said is consistent with the trends we've seen so far is the same switching trends. So half or more of those patients switching from injectable prophy drugs, and then the other half switching from acute only, coming over to prophylaxis. Now they can do it with an oral. So very consistent trends pre-launch, during launch, and kind of looking forward.
And I know this is early, but since you mentioned some of the survey data, another key thing is patient persistency and the discontinuation rate. Can you maybe talk about some of your early signals there in terms of patients that remain on therapy?
Yeah, so I mean, patients are, the great majority are having a really good experience, so they're staying on drug. What we said at the end of Q3 is that 80% of the patients who had started Orladeyo were still on drug. We see the kind of the 1 year, once patients have been on a year, we see that settling out at around 70% of patients staying on drug.
Right.
And again, I think it's because Orladeyo is controlling their attacks and doing so with a low burden of treatment.
Excellent. Okay. Well, great. So maybe going on to questions around the more guidance, I guess, oriented questions. You've been pretty clear, I think, that worldwide peak revenue guidance for Orladeyo, the original bar that you set of sort of 500 million or so is too low, and this could potentially be reset, I guess, once you've got about a year under your belt. Just give us a sense. When you do that and you provide a better line of sight, would we see maybe a breakout by geography, or maybe just give us a sense of how you're thinking about that?
Yeah, let me start, Charlie, and then you can add if I missed something. But yeah, you're right. That's a 2.5-year-old number of $500 million plus peak sales, and now that we've got nearly a year under our belt, we think it's substantially higher than that. And we're just working through some of the details around how ex-US contributes to that number, and so probably sometime in the new year, we'll be updating that number. But it's still substantially driven by the US. And I'll let Charlie describe the ratios that he sees with other drugs, but the US is the big contributor. But the beauty of this drug is that a country that generates $10 million, you add up enough of those, and that's real revenue
Right.
to the number. And so we're bringing this drug everywhere around the globe, and we think that when you add those all up, while it's less than the US, it's still a nice contributor. Charlie, you could talk about ratios and.
Yeah, Chris, what we see with some of the more mature prophy brands, once they kind of reach peak, is getting to about 80% of sales is the US and roughly 20% otherwise. I think that's probably a good guide for the future, that general direction. And a lot of that is based, there are clearly patients all over the world who need this drug, but pricing tends to be lower ex-US, and that becomes one of the big drivers. But we're really excited the opportunity to drive increases in prophylaxis use globally, and doing that in US and starting to do it in Europe, and we'll do that in other geographies as well.
Okay, excellent. And then on your third quarter call, I think you guys, at least I got a sense that you were pretty excited to be able to present the data at the college meeting, the ACAAI meeting in New Orleans in person. Talk a little bit about the overall, I guess, reaction to the new data you presented and what stood out most to physicians, and just talk a bit about how that event might help build momentum into 2022.
Yeah, I'll give you a funny anecdote. So Charlie and I were with two pretty large practitioners in the field of HAE, and one of them said, so what new data are you presenting? And I talked about the switch data and the posters that we had, and he goes, oh, I know that data. I was part of your ad board. And he goes, that's the data where if you're controlled on an injectable prophy drug and you switch to Orladeyo, you stay controlled. So why wouldn't everybody go on Orladeyo? Is probably the best way to describe the reaction that we've gotten. I mean, it's really powerful data. And Helen, I don't know if you want to talk about the 96-week data. I think two things that are really going to be another kind of inflection opportunity for us is really getting word out that Orladeyo works really well. I mean, the whole reason we're getting that retention that Charlie just described is because they're doing well, they're getting controlled on our drug. So I'll let Helen talk a little bit about the data.
Yeah, we're seeing in the trial data and in the reports that we're presenting that through the 96-week outcomes in the trial follow-on, patients are experiencing sustained low rates of attacks. So that the reduction in attacks that they've seen is sustained throughout that period. And we're seeing also in some of the patients who are switching from other long-term prophylaxis to ORLADEYO that they're having that same also low rate of attack and then sustained in the APEX-S study for 12 months. So what we're seeing across both the long-term follow-up from the pivotal trial and the APEX-S study trial is this durability of response. It's a good, solid response, a low attack rate, durability, and it's whether or not they were on prior prophylaxis.
Excellent. And maybe going back to an earlier point we touched on, which is discontinuations. With the durability data that you mentioned from New Orleans, and I heard you, Charlie, talk about the 80% sort of retention rate, which seems to be relatively consistent with what you saw in the clinic. What are the plans or the efforts that it's trying to maybe attack that 20% number and drive it lower? In terms of addressing some of the tolerability issues or other aspects. Is there something that can be done there, or is that sort of a number you think is sort of fixed?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And just to be clear, I said 80% year to date. We see it settling out more like 70%, but still very much in line with our clinical trials. The big thing that we focused on is setting expectations with patients. So the leading reason patients drop off is GI adverse events. But if we set expectations that if you have these events, they tend to go away early in therapy, which is what we saw in our clinical trials. They tend to be relatively mild. They don't require additional treatments. Doing that helps the patients through the process because patients really want to be on an oral drug. So we work on setting that expectation at the prescriber level and then doing it through our specialty pharmacy services as well. And we just keep emphasizing that's the biggest thing that we can do. And then the other thing is just this long-term efficacy that Helen was describing. The fact that these patients have that low rate of attacks and it's really sustained, that gives the prescribers that much more confidence, and then they're going to convey more confidence in terms of what you can expect. Stress is such a big trigger of attacks in HAE, and so the flip side of that is confidence, and we want to make sure that patients feel confident in the drug that they're taking, and so that through all these means that's what we're really focused on.
Another upside, Chris, is that Charlie's just getting going and his team is just getting going is patient-to-patient interactions. Word of mouth, and somebody who's had a good experience and somebody who's contemplating whether or not to go on, or how they navigated maybe some early GI adverse events, that kind of stuff, patient-to-patient, it's really powerful. And Zoom's not a great way to do that. So getting people face-to-face is what we're working on now. And when that kicks in, we think that could be another inflection point to increase growth.
Got it. Yeah, and it's I guess kind of hard to think about COVID impacts on a drug that's exceeded expectations like ORLADEYO has, but I guess it's an interesting sort of setup in that this drug for all intents and purposes really hasn't known a non-COVID world. I mean, I guess up to this point, how do we expect, from what of the market and the HAE, market, how do you see, this market sort of going back to, I guess a fully post-COVID world is perhaps not something that's on the horizon near term, but the sort of as things sort of wind down, how are you seeing changes in physician and patient behavior, and sort of what are the plans to sort of adapt to that?
Charlie, before I'll take a shot at one part of it, but then it'd be nice to contrast what you're seeing outside of the U.S. and what you're seeing inside of the U.S. in terms of COVID. But the bottom line, Chris, it hit Charlie and I, the Saturday of New Orleans, that his team has been fighting this fight with two hands tied behind their back. right? When you start hearing doctors talking to each other and the excitement level going up, when you see a couple of reps exchanging ideas because they're, out to dinner with each other, or they're standing at a booth together talking through, all that kind of stuff hasn't been happening, right? That normally happens in a launch. And as you said, we still were wildly successful with the launch. And so when that stuff starts to kick in, watch out, because I really think, again, that's another place for inflection. But Charlie, you might want to talk about clinical practice and the impact of COVID in the U.S. and outside of the U.S.
Yeah, well, Chris, we track this all the way through the last year and a half or so of COVID, and what we saw is that patients and doctors generally, they were not losing touch with each other, at least in the U.S. So the visits, or at least telemedicine, was still happening. Patients, fortunately, at least in the U.S., have access to a lot of therapies these days. So the number of visits patients have with their doctors was down anyway. So even if COVID, starts to wane a bit here, we don't expect a huge rush to go back to the doctor's office or anything like that. But I agree with John's comments. It's about the in-person interactions, and it's like when the patients do come in, what interactions has the doctor had at that point? What interactions has the patient had at that point? And how much does that lead to a different conversation maybe than they would have had 6 or 9 months ago? I think that becomes the opportunity as patients talk to each other, as doctors talk to each other, and we talk to all of them.
Excellent. And maybe just on the competitive environment, I would imagine, Takeda and CSL Behring can't be particularly thrilled, I guess, with all the patient switching dynamics that are being seen. Just again, I know it's still early in the game here, but what's your sense of the counter detailing messages on ORLADEYO? What are you hearing back from docs that is being messaged as people try to sort of stave the loss here of patients?
And you hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
The fact that we're getting patients to switch from their drug onto ours has got to be painful. So they're doing the things you would expect that they would do, which is, they're pointing back to really old data from the pivotal trial saying, oh, it doesn't work nearly as well. And you just heard from Helen, we got 96-week data that says works pretty similar to what they saw, with their drug. No drug's perfect, but all these drugs work pretty well is the bottom line. And then, kicking at the adverse events and things like that. And again, no drug's perfect. Their drug has injection site pain when you stick a needle in to give the drug. And yet we've had GI adverse events with our drug. And so, make it a big deal out of that. But we're not afraid. I think Charlie's team has done a great job of competing. The great news is it's about skill in competing versus size. Right? These sales forces aren't huge. This isn't an arms race. This is, skillful delivery of a message and having a great product. And we have both.
We like our data. We like our product. So we've got what we need.
Awesome. All right. Love that answer. All right. So, look, we spent 20 minutes now on ORLADEYO, and I know there's so much more to the story. So, and we're given this short shrift, so I apologize. But let's talk about the pipeline. 9930, oral factor D inhibitor, very intriguing setup here. Maybe just maybe talk about enrollment. What are your expectations for the relative enrolling patient in REDEEM-2? That's the not monotherapy PNH trial. Obviously set up with other therapies on the market. What's your sense there for enrollment?
Bill, it might be good for you to just describe all three studies actually, and then kind of early to say when they'll be done, but just roughly what we're doing.
We're at a great place in all three studies with startup activities at sites around the world. So we have 2 pivotal studies in PNH. One's an active controlled study, and the other one's placebo controlled. And we're getting great traction in terms of interest from hematologists and principal investigators at sites all over. So that's moving along, and we expect first patients to be randomized this year. And similarly, in the renal nephritis basket study, which is studying IgA nephropathy, C3 glomerulopathy, and primary membranous nephropathy, that's much smaller. It's open label. It's high science. It requires biopsies before and after. And again, the enthusiasm is there The sites are getting set up, and our expectation is that study will start this year too. As John said, it's hard to know how long they're going to take to fully recruit. Complement is really, really active in industry as a target, as everybody knows, so there's plenty of competition. Our job is to do the best we possibly can in interacting with the sites, the regulators and the investigators, and the advocacy community to attract patients to our studies. So that's what we're focused on.
So, maybe one last question here before we run out of time, but it's my sense that the stock is reflecting very little value here for this program. Maybe walk us through the cadence of updates on 9930 specifically. Obviously, this will be, you'll be giving us enrollment at the updates, et cetera, but how should we think about, value inflecting updates here as you progress in development of this product?
Yeah, I don't think it's like BioCryst used to be, even 2 years ago, you got a pivotal study or you're about to get a approval decision, whatever. Now it's, every quarter we have revenue updates, right, on how we're doing with ORLADEYO and how the launch is going. It feels like every quarter or, every couple of quarters that we've got, another place where we're filing or we've gotten an approval in another part of the world and we're launching. And so that stuff's going to be just a steady drumbeat. And then, we're going to enroll these studies as fast as we can, right? Doing it in a high quality way. And so over the next couple of years, you're going to get data from the proof of concept in three nephritis indications, right? Which would then lead us into pivotal studies for all 3 of those indications if we're successful, right? Which that leads to ultimate approval, right? And getting those on the market. And then in the 2 pivotals in PNH, at some point, we're going to get the readouts on those, and then we're going to be filing. And all of this is on the heels of launching ORLADEYO. So I think it's going to be a steady drumbeat. And, there's not some magical point in time, where it's a good time to take a look at BioCryst. Now's the time to look at BioCryst because the value creation from here out as far as I can see is huge because of the fact that we've got a product on the market and a pipeline and a discovery engine that's going to repeat this over and over again.
Awesome. Well, I agree. I actually have maybe another hour's worth of questions, but unfortunately we are out of time here. So thanks so much, guys, for all the time and best of luck as we get into 2022.
Thanks, Chris.